The snow had started falling 2 days before Abigail Ellis reached the Wyoming mountains, but she'd kept riding anyway. Her mare's breath came out in white puffs against the gray afternoon sky, and ice crystals formed on the animal's dark mane. Abigail pulled her wool coat tighter, though it did little against the bitter wind that cut through the mountain pass like a blade. She was 27 years old, taller than most women and broader in the shoulders from years of lifting patients at the small medical station in Kansas. Her hands, now stiff with cold as they gripped the reins, bore the calluses of honest work hands that had set bones, cleaned wounds, and held the dying as they passed. Those same hands had once worn an engagement ring, though she'd sold it months ago to buy supplies for this journey. The letter in her coat pocket was worn soft from handling. She'd read it so many times she could recite it from memory, though the words were few and simple. Micah Reed wasn't a man for flowery language. She remembered him from the medical station, a quiet cowboy with a broken leg who'd been thrown from a wild Mustang. He'd spent 3 weeks under her care, barely speaking except to say, "Thank you, ma'am," when she brought his meals or changed his bandages. The day he'd left, walking steady on his healed leg, he'd pressed the folded paper into her hand. "If you ever get tired of that world out there," he'd said, not quite meeting her eyes, "my cabin's always got an open door." Then he'd mounted his horse and ridden off without looking back, leaving her standing in the dusty street holding his strange invitation. That had been 8 months ago, 8 months of watching her world crumble piece by piece. First came James's ultimatum. He wouldn't marry a woman who insisted on working with her hands, touching strange men's bodies, coming home with blood on her apron. "It ain't proper," he'd said, standing in her small parlor with his hat in his hands. "A wife should keep house, not tend to cowboys and drifters." She'd given him back his ring that very evening. Then the gossip started. Whispers followed her through the general store. Proper ladies crossed the street when they saw her coming. Even the doctor at the medical station began suggesting she might be happier elsewhere. The final insult came when the new town council voted to hire only married women or widows for nursing work, for propriety's sake, they said. So she'd packed what little she owned, sold what she couldn't carry, and pointed her mare west toward the mountains, toward a cabin she'd never seen, owned by a man she barely knew, following a promise that might mean nothing at all. The storm was worsening. Snow fell in thick curtains now, and Abigail could barely see 10 feet ahead. Her mare stumbled, caught herself, and pressed on. They'd passed the last town hours ago, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the mountainside like birds seeking shelter. She'd asked about the Reed place there, and the storekeeper had given her a long look before pointing up the trail. "About 5 miles up, past the lightning-struck pine," he'd said, though I can't imagine what business a lady's got with Micah Reed. She hadn't bothered explaining. Let them wonder. The lightning-struck pine appeared through the snow like a black finger pointing at the sky. Abigail turned her mare up a narrower trail, following fresh wheel ruts that suggested someone had passed this way recently. The trees pressed close on either side, heavy with snow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Then she saw it, a small cabin built of hewn logs, smoke rising from a stone chimney. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a lean-to stable attached to one side. Simple, sturdy, isolated, a hermit's home. Abigail dismounted, her legs nearly buckling from cold and exhaustion. She led her mare to the stable, unsaddled her with numb fingers, and made sure there was hay in the manger. Only then did she approach the cabin door. She stood there for a long moment, snow gathering on her shoulders and hat. What was she doing here? What did she expect from a man she'd known for 3 weeks, who'd barely strung 10 words together in all that time, but she'd burned every bridge behind her, sold everything she couldn't pack. There was nowhere else to go. She knocked. The door opened almost immediately. As if he'd been waiting, Micah Reed stood in the doorway, looking exactly as she remembered. Tall, lean, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore canvas pants and a flannel shirt. No coat despite the cold. His expression didn't change when he saw her. Showed no surprise at finding a woman on his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard. He simply stepped back and held the door open. Abigail entered, bringing a swirl of snow with her. The cabin's warmth hit her like a wall-blessed heat from a pot-bellied stove in the corner. She stood dripping on the wooden floor, suddenly aware of how she must look, trail-worn, half-frozen, showing up like a stray dog seeking shelter. "I got your letter," she said, her voice hoarse from cold. Micah closed the door against the storm. "I see that." The cabin was one room. She noticed. A bed with a wooden frame sat against one wall, covered with wool blankets and a bearskin. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Shelves held supplies, canned goods, coffee, flour. A rifle hung on pegs above the door. Everything neat, orderly, masculine. "I can explain," Abigail began, but Micah held up a hand. "No need." He moved to the stove, poured coffee from a pot that sat warming there. "You're here, that's explanation enough." He handed her the cup. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, his warm against her frozen ones. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup, feeling life return to her fingers. "The mare's in your stable," she said. "I'll tend to her proper once I warm up. She's fine where she is." Micah took her wet coat, hung it on a peg near the stove. "Sit, you look ready to fall over." Abigail sank into one of the chairs. The coffee was strong, bitter, perfect. She watched Micah move around the small space, adding wood to the stove, setting a pot of stew to warm. He moved with the easy efficiency of a man long accustomed to solitude. "How long you been riding?" he asked without turning around. 2 days, started before the storm hit." "From Kansas?" "Yes." He nodded, as if this made perfect sense, as if women regularly rode hundreds of miles through blizzards to show up at his door. The stew was venison with wild onions and potatoes. They ate in silence, the only sounds the storm outside and the crackling stove. Abigail found herself stealing glances at him. He looked older than she remembered, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, or maybe she just hadn't noticed. Focused as she'd been on his broken leg and fever. When they finished eating, Abigail cleared the dishes without being asked. It felt natural, falling into the rhythm of domestic tasks. Micah watched her from his chair, saying nothing. Finally, she couldn't avoid it any longer. The elephant in the room, the single bed, the lack of any other sleeping arrangements. She set down her dish towel, squared her shoulders. "I'll sleep on the floor," she said. "I brought blankets. Won't be any trouble." Micah stood slowly. He walked to the bed, looked at it, then back at her. Without a word, he tapped his hand once on the mattress, a simple, deliberate gesture. Then he moved to the stove, banking it for the night. The meaning was clear. "Sleep here. I'm not the kind of man you need to fear." Abigail felt something tight in her chest loosen. She pulled her blankets from her pack, made a pallet on the floor near the stove. When she looked up, Micah was pulling on his coat. "Where are you going?" "Check the animals. Be back directly." He went out into the storm, leaving her alone in the warm cabin. Abigail changed quickly into her nightclothes, wrapped herself in her blankets on the floor. By the time Micah returned, she was feigning sleep, watching through cracked eyelids as he moved quietly around the cabin, preparing for bed. He blew out the lantern. In the darkness, she heard him settle onto the bed, fully clothed from the sound of it. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin was warm and still. For the first time in months, Abigail felt something like peace. She'd taken the biggest gamble of her life, riding into the wilderness on the strength of a barely there invitation. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, the need to figure out what exactly this arrangement would be. But tonight, she was warm, fed, and safe. The floor was hard beneath her, but she'd slept in worse places. And somewhere in the darkness, a man who understood the value of silence was keeping his own counsel, asking nothing of her but what she was willing to give. As sleep finally took her, Abigail thought she heard him shift in his bed, perhaps turn to look in her direction, but it might have been her imagination, or the settling of the cabin in the storm. Either way, morning would come soon enough, bringing with it whatever strange new life awaited her in this mountain refuge. Abigail woke to the sound of wood being added to the stove. Gray morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing Micah crouched by the fire, his movements quiet and deliberate. She lay still, watching him through half-closed eyes as he coaxed the flames back to life. The storm had passed in the night. Outside, the world was muffled under fresh snow, and she could hear the soft drip of icicles melting from the eaves. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but she'd endured worse. At the medical station, she'd often dozed in a chair beside critical patients, catching what rest she could between their fevered cries. "Coffee's on," Micah said without turning around, somehow knowing she was awake. She sat up, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders. In the morning light, the cabin's simplicity was even more apparent. One room, perhaps 20 feet by 16. The bed where Micah had slept took up a good portion of one wall, a sturdy frame he'd probably built himself, with a thick straw mattress and heavy wool blankets. No curtains on the window, no rugs on the floor, no decorations save for a calendar tacked to the wall, still showing October though it was now December. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. They prepared breakfast together without speaking, falling into an easy rhythm. She mixed biscuit dough while he sliced bacon. He set the table while she tended the skillet. It felt strangely natural, as if they'd done this countless times before. But when they sat down to eat, the silence grew heavy with unspoken questions. Abigail broke it first. "I'll earn my keep. I can cook, clean, tend the animals. I'm strong. I can split wood, haul water." Micah looked up from his plate. "Didn't ask you to earn anything." "I won't be a burden." "Didn't say you were." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Then what am I? Why did you offer—" She stopped, frustrated by his calm demeanor. "Most men would want to know why I'm here, why I left everything behind." He considered this, chewing slowly. "Figure you'll tell me if you want to, or you won't. Either way, you're here now." After breakfast, Abigail set about making herself useful. She swept the floor, washed the dishes, took inventory of the supplies. Micah pulled on his coat and went out to tend his small herd of cattle. Through the window, she watched him trudge through the snow, a solitary figure against the white landscape. The cabin told its own story to someone who knew how to look. Everything was functional, well-maintained but austere. The shelves held basic supplies, no luxuries, nothing decorative. A man's shirts hung on pegs, all mended with careful but unpracticed stitches. A shaving mirror hung above a wash basin, alongside a straight razor and worn strop. But it was what wasn't there that spoke loudest. No photographs, no letters tied with ribbon, no woman's touch anywhere. This was the home of someone who'd either chosen solitude or had it chosen for him. When Micah returned at midday, stamping snow from his boots, Abigail had soup warming on the stove and fresh bread cooling on the table. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. "You've been busy." "Idle hands," she said, then caught herself. It was something James used to say, usually followed by a lecture about proper women's work. She turned back to the stove, stirring the soup with unnecessary vigor. They ate lunch in their now familiar silence. Afterward, Micah surprised her by speaking first. "There's a trunk in the corner. Was my mother's. Might find something useful in there. Fabric, thread, such like. If you've a mind to look." Abigail glanced at the trunk she'd noticed, but hadn't dared investigate. I wouldn't want to intrude. She's been gone 10 years. Things ought to be used, not just sit gathering dust. That afternoon, while Micah worked on repairing a harness, Abigail opened the trunk. The scent of lavender sachets rose up, faint but still present. Inside were folded quilts, balls of yarn, needles and thread, and at the bottom, a few dresses wrapped in tissue paper, simple calico work dresses. Nothing fancy, but well made. She held one up against herself. It would be short. Micah's mother must have been a smaller woman, but the waist might fit with some alteration. Her own dresses were travel-worn, and she'd only brought 2. Take what you need, Micah said from across the room, not looking up from his work. That evening, as she prepared supper, the question of sleeping arrangements loomed again. She'd assumed after the first night that the floor would be her permanent spot, but as she laid out her blankets again, Micah stood and walked to the bed. He tapped it once with his hand, just as he had the night before, then looked at her steadily. I'll sleep on the floor, Abigail said firmly. I brought blankets. I'm used to discomfort. He didn't argue, didn't insist. He simply tapped the bed once more and went back to banking the fire. The message was clear. The offer stood. No pressure, no expectations. She slept on the floor again that night, but noticed he'd added an extra buffalo hide to her makeshift pallet while she was outside using the privy. Small kindnesses, offered without comment. Days passed in this pattern. They developed routines without discussing them. Abigail took over the cooking and inside work. Micah handled the animals and heavy labor, though she helped when he'd let her. They ate meals together, worked in companionable silence, and each night he'd tap the bed once before settling onto it fully clothed. She learned his rhythms: coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, bacon crisp but not burned. He liked his shirts pressed with the old flat iron she found under the sink, though he'd never ask for it. He was out the door by first light and back by sunset, regular as clockwork unless weather kept him in. One evening, a week into her stay, Abigail finally asked, "Why do you tap the bed?" Micah looked up from the bridle he was mending. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. My PA used to say a man's character shows in how he treats those who can't fight back, he said finally. You showed up at my door half froze, nowhere else to go. Some would see that as opportunity. I want you to know that's not why I asked you here. Then why did you... He went back to his work, fingers moving steadily over the leather. You were kind to me when I was hurt. Not many are. A pause. And I could see you were drowning there, same as I could see infection in a wound. Sometimes folks need a place to heal. That's all. Abigail felt her throat tighten. She'd been prepared for demands, expectations, the need to fend off advances. She hadn't been prepared for simple decency. That night, when he tapped the bed, she hesitated. The floor was hard, cold despite the buffalo hide. Her back ached, and winter had barely begun. But still, I'll keep to the floor, she said. It wouldn't be proper otherwise. Micah nodded, accepting her decision without argument. But the next morning, she found he'd built a raised platform near the stove, just a few inches off the ground, but enough to keep the cold from seeping through. Rough-hewn planks fitted together, the perfect size for her bedroll. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, imagining him working on it in the pre-dawn darkness, trying not to wake her. Such a simple thing, but it spoke volumes. Thank you, she said when he came in for breakfast. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Floor's too cold for anyone come winter. Should have thought of it sooner. They ate their breakfast in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Comfortable, complete, outside. Snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin was warm and safe. Abigail found herself humming as she cleared the dishes, the first time she'd felt light enough to hum in months. She caught Micah watching her, something almost like a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately, as he usually did. "It's good to hear music again," he said quietly, then pulled on his coat and headed out to his work. Abigail stood at the window, watching him disappear into the swirling snow. Her reflection stared back from the glass, a woman she hardly recognized. No longer the proper nurse from Kansas, engaged to a respectable man, no longer drowning in others' expectations. Just Abigail, finding her footing in a strange new life. Behind her, the bed sat untouched, Micah's quiet offer renewed each night and declined each morning. But on her new platform, raised above the cold floor by his careful hands, she'd slept better than she had in months. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses were the most profound. The morning routine had become sacred in its simplicity. Micah would rise first, his footsteps on the cabin floor as familiar to Abigail now as her own heartbeat. The scratch of a match, the creak of the stove door, the whistle of the coffee pot, a symphony of ordinary sounds that marked the beginning of each day. She would lie still for a few minutes more, wrapped in her blankets on the raised platform he'd built, listening to him move about in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 weeks had passed since she'd arrived at his door. 3 weeks of quiet mornings and working side by side, of meals shared in comfortable silence and evenings by the fire. The snow had continued to fall intermittently, sealing them into their own small world. The nearest town was 5 miles down a trail that would be treacherous until spring, and neither of them seemed inclined to make the journey. This morning was no different. Abigail rose, dressed quickly behind the blanket she'd hung for privacy, and joined Micah at the table. He'd already poured her coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, just as she liked it. She'd never told him her preference. He'd simply observed and remembered. They ate biscuits with honey and thick slices of bacon. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin was warm and still. Abigail had learned to gauge Micah's mood by the set of his shoulders, the tempo of his movements. Today he seemed thoughtful, his gray eyes distant as he gazed out the frost-etched window. "Storm's getting worse," he said finally. "Might be stuck inside today." She nodded, already mentally planning how to fill the hours. There was mending to do, and she'd found his mother's recipe box tucked away in a drawer. "I could try my hand at that apple cake recipe I found. We've still got those dried apples from town." "She made that every Sunday," Micah said quietly. It was the most he'd ever said about his mother. House would smell like cinnamon for hours. They cleared the breakfast dishes together, working in their practice dance around the small space. As Abigail dried the last plate, she noticed Micah pull something from a high shelf, a wooden box she hadn't seen before. "Checkers," he explained, setting it on the table. "If we're trapped inside, might as well pass the time." It was the first purely social thing he'd suggested since her arrival. She smiled, settling into her chair across from him. "I should warn you, I played against every patient who could sit up at the medical station. I don't lose often." "We'll see about that." They played 3 games before lunch, Micah winning 2 with a quiet strategy that reminded her of everything else about him. Patient, observant, making no unnecessary moves. During the 3rd game, as she pondered her next move, he spoke unexpectedly. "What happened back there in Kansas?" Abigail's hand hovered over a checker. She had been waiting for this question since her arrival, but his timing caught her off guard. Perhaps that was intentional, catching her when her defenses were down, focused on the game. "My fiancé decided I wasn't suitable wife material," she said, moving her piece. "James Hartley, good family, owns the Mercantile. We'd been engaged 2 years. Long time. He kept saying we'd marry when I gave up nursing. I kept thinking he'd come to understand why I couldn't." She captured one of his checkers with perhaps more force than necessary. "Then one day he showed up with an ultimatum. The work or him. You chose the work." "I chose myself." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And the whole town made sure I knew what they thought of that choice. Whispers at first, Then louder talk. Then the town council decided unmarried women shouldn't be handling male patients. For propriety, Micah made his move. Kinged one of his pieces. Their loss. That's what I told myself. Right up until I couldn't buy flour at the general store without folks staring. Until the boarding house asked me to find other arrangements. Until even the doctor suggested I might be happier elsewhere. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Turns out, a woman who won't know her place makes everyone uncomfortable. Is that what you think you did not know your place? She considered this. I knew exactly what my place was supposed to be. Standing behind James at church socials, keeping his house, raising his children, forgetting I'd ever known how to set a bone or stitch a wound. She moved another checker. I just couldn't shrink myself down enough to fit into it. They finished the game in silence. Micah won again, then set up for another. The wind rattled the windows, and snow piled against the glass. The cabin felt even smaller than usual, but not confining. Safe, like a ship's cabin in a storm. Your turn, Abigail said as they began the new game. Why are you out here alone? Micah's hand stilled on his checker. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, came back from driving cattle to find my father dead and the land in dispute. Neighbor claimed Pa had sold it to him before he died. Had a paper that might have been real, might not. Judge in town believed him over me. Why? Because Herman Walsh had friends and money, and I had neither. His voice held no bitterness, just flat acceptance. Been fighting it 3 years now. New judge might hear the case again come spring, but without proof. He shrugged. That's why you stay to fight for the land. Where else would I go? He moved his checker, a defensive play. This cabin, that view of the mountains, it's all I've ever wanted. Let them take the legal deed. I'm still here, still working the land. Man can't own a mountain anyway. Just borrow it for a while. They played until lunch. Then Abigail made the apple cake while Micah repaired a broken chair. The cabin filled with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples. Just as he'd remembered. She caught him closing his eyes once, breathing deeply, and wondered what memories the smell conjured. As afternoon wore into evening, the storm showed no signs of abating. They ate supper venison stew and warm cake, and settled by the stove. Abigail had found some knitting in his mother's trunk and was working on a scarf. Micah cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. That first night, she said suddenly, when I knocked on your door, weren't you surprised at all? He looked up from his work. Been watching the trail for 8 months. Saw you coming up through the storm. Had time to think about what I'd do. And what did you decide? To open the door. He went back to his rifle. Rest sorted itself out. The evening deepened. Outside, the wind had calmed, but snow still fell steadily. They'd be truly snowed in by morning, the trail impassable. The thought should have worried her, but instead she felt only contentment. This strange, quiet life suited her better than she'd ever imagined. As bedtime approached, their nightly ritual played out again. Micah stood, walked to the bed, and tapped it once with his hand. The same offer, made the same way, every single night. Why do you keep asking? Abigail said softly. You know what my answer will be. Maybe I'm not asking, he replied. Maybe I'm just reminding you that you have a choice, that you'll always have a choice here. Something in his words made her throat tight. In Kansas, her choices had been stripped away one by one until leaving was the only option left. Here, in this simple cabin with this complicated man, she was given the same choice every night and the freedom to make it. She made her bed on the platform, wrapped herself in quilts that smelled faintly of his mother's lavender sachets. Micah banked the fire and settled onto his bed fully clothed. As always, the storm wrapped around the cabin like a living thing, but inside was warm and quiet. Micah, she said into the darkness. Thank you for the choice. He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, thank you for staying. She smiled into her pillow. Tomorrow would bring more snow, more quiet meals, more games of checkers where he'd probably win, more chances to learn the rhythms of this new life, to find out who she was when no one was telling her who she should be. As sleep took her, she thought she heard him shift in his bed, perhaps looking in her direction. 3 weeks in, and he was still a mystery in many ways. But mysteries could be patient things, revealing themselves slowly like mountains emerging from fog. For now, it was enough to be here, to be warm, to be given choices without expectations. The rest, as Micah had said, would sort itself out. The evening had started like any other. Supper dishes washed and put away, the fire crackling in the stove, and Micah working on a piece of harness while Abigail darned one of his socks. A month into her stay, she'd taken over all the mending without discussion. It needed doing, and her hands needed occupation. "You're favoring your left side," she said, not looking up from her work. "That old injury bothering you again?" Micah's hands stilled on the leather. She'd noticed him wincing when he thought she wasn't watching, the way he'd shifted his weight when standing from dinner. The observational skills that made her a good nurse hadn't disappeared just because she'd left Kansas. "It's nothing," he said, resuming his work. "It's not nothing if it's affecting your movement. That break didn't heal quite right, did it?" I wondered at the time. But the doctor said, "Leave it be, Abigail." The sharpness in his tone made her look up. He'd never spoken to her harshly before. His jaw was tight, a muscle working beneath the stubble he hadn't shaved that morning. "I'm only trying to help," she said carefully. "I could examine it, maybe—" I said leave it. He set down the harness and stood abruptly, favoring his right leg despite his efforts to hide it. "I don't need your nursing." The words stung more than they should have. "Fine," she said, focusing intently on her darning. "Suffer if you want to." He grabbed his coat and went outside, though it was full dark and starting to snow again. The door closed harder than necessary behind him. Abigail sat alone in the sudden quiet, needle suspended over the sock. In Kansas, James had hated when she tried to help with anything medical, saw it as her trying to prove she was smarter than him. She'd thought Micah was different, but perhaps all men were the same when it came to showing weakness. An hour passed. The snow was falling heavier now, and still he hadn't returned. Despite her anger, worry crept in. His leg was clearly paining him, and wandering around in the dark on uneven ground covered in snow. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside. "Micah?" No answer. She found his tracks leading toward the stable and followed them. Inside, she found him sitting on a barrel, his bad leg extended, face drawn with pain he was no longer trying to hide. "Go back inside," he said without looking at her. "No." "Abigail." "No." She moved closer, saw how he was holding his leg. "You're being foolish. Whatever's wrong, ignoring it won't help." "It's not—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "It's not about the leg." She waited, standing in the cold stable, listening to the horses shift in their stalls. "My father died of an infection," he said finally. "Started as nothing, just a cut on his hand from a fence nail. He wouldn't let anyone look at it, said he was fine. By the time he admitted something was wrong, the poison was in his blood. Took him 3 days to die, and I couldn't do anything but watch." Understanding dawned. "You're not your father, Micah, and I'm not some traveling medicine show fraud. You know what I can do. You were there for 3 weeks while I put you back together." "That's just it." He looked up at her then, and she saw something raw in his eyes. "You did put me back together, and then you sent me on my way, and I spent 8 months thinking about things I had no right to think. So I sent that letter, half hoping you'd never come, half praying you would. And now you're here, and every day I watch you making this place better just by being in it. And He stopped, looked away. "I can't be weak in front of you, not again." Abigail felt her heart skip. In all their quiet meals and comfortable silences, He'd never spoken so many words at once, never revealed so much. She moved closer, knelt beside him despite the cold stable floor. "Strength isn't about never needing help," she said softly. "It's about knowing when to accept it. You taught me that, whether you meant to or not. You opened your door to me when I had nowhere else to go. Let me return the favor." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Inside," she said, "where it's warm and I can see properly." Back in the cabin, she had him sit on the bed and roll up his trouser leg. The old break site was swollen. The muscle around it knotted with tension. She'd seen this before. Scar tissue and improperly healed bone causing increasing problems over time. "The doctor in town rushed the setting," she said, gently examining the area. "Probably didn't want to deal with a cowboy who couldn't pay much. The bone healed, but not aligned properly. Can anything be done?" "Not about the bone, not now, but I can help with the pain. Keep the muscles from seizing up." She looked up at him. "If you'll let me." He nodded again, and she went to work. She had him lie back while she massaged the knotted muscles, working with practiced skill to release the tension. He flinched at first, then gradually relaxed as the pain began to ease. "You carry too much weight on your right side, compensating," she said as she worked. "It's throwing your whole body out of alignment. I can show you exercises that might help." "You do that." She paused, hands still on his leg. "Micah, what did you think I came here for, to cook your meals and darn your socks and pretend I never knew how to do anything else?" "I didn't think, I just hoped you'd come." She resumed her work, something shifting in her chest. All those months in Kansas, fighting to be allowed to use her skills. And here was a man who'd been afraid to ask for them because he thought it would make him seem less in her eyes. When she finished, she helped him sit up. The tight lines around his mouth had eased, and he moved more freely. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's what I'm here for." "No." He caught her hand as she turned away. "That's not what you're here for. You're here because this place was dying before you came. Just me and the mountains and the silence. Now there's music again. Life again. That's what you're here for." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. "I was dying too," she admitted. "All those proper people with their proper lives, trying to squeeze me into their proper little box. I couldn't breathe." "You're breathing now." "Yes." They sat there in the lamplight, her hand still in his. It was the first time he'd voluntarily touched her beyond the casual brush of fingers passing dishes. His hand was calloused, strong, gentle. "I should make some liniment," she said finally. "For your leg. I saw wild arnica growing near the stream before the snow started. Come spring, I'll gather some." "Come spring," he repeated, and she heard the question in it. Would she still be here come spring? "Yes," she said, answering what he hadn't quite asked. "Come spring." He squeezed her hand once, then let go. She busied herself making tea, something to settle them both before bed. As she worked, she was aware of him watching her, something different in his gaze now. Not the careful distance he'd maintained, but something warmer, more open. That night, when he tapped the bed in their ritual, she hesitated longer than usual. They'd crossed some invisible line tonight, shared things that couldn't be taken back. "Not yet," she said softly. "But thank you." He smiled, a real smile, rare as sunshine in December. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." She made her bed on the platform, but sleep was slow in coming. She could hear him breathing in the darkness, favoring his leg less as he shifted position. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their small world for another night. "Abigail," his voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes." "That letter I sent, I wrote it 12 times, kept trying to find the right words to say what I wanted to say. Finally, just sent the simple version." "What did the other version say?" A long pause. "That I'd never met anyone who saw people the way you do. Not just their broken parts, but who they could be when they healed. That 3 weeks wasn't nearly enough time. That I had no right to ask, but I was asking anyway. Her throat felt tight. The simple version worked just fine. Did it? I'm here, aren't I? She heard him shift, perhaps turning to face her direction in the dark. Yes, you are. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them had changed. It held possibility now, promise, like seeds under snow, waiting for spring to show what might grow. The sun had finally broken through after 3 days of snow, and Abigail was taking advantage of the clear weather to repair the chicken coop. She'd found the lumber stacked behind the stable, along with Micah's tools, and set to work without asking permission. 2 months into her stay, she'd stopped asking permission for things that needed doing. She was hammering a loose board back into place when she heard the horses. 3 riders coming up the trail, their voices carrying on the still mountain air. Micah was out checking his cattle in the far pasture. Wouldn't be back for hours. The riders stopped at the edge of the property. 3 men, all wearing town clothes unsuited for the mountain weather. She recognized one. Harold Walsh, nephew of the man claiming Micah's land. The other 2 were strangers, but their type was familiar enough. Hired muscle, probably. Well, well, Harold said, dismounting with an unpleasant smile. The rumors are true. Reed's got himself a woman. Abigail straightened, hammer still in her hand. Can I help you, gentlemen? Gentlemen. Harold laughed. Hear that, boys? The lady thinks we're gentlemen. He moved closer, eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Question is, are you a lady living out here with Reed? No wedding ring I can see. State your business or move along, Abigail said calmly, though her grip on the hammer tightened. Our business is with Reed, about this land he's squatting on. My uncle's land. Harold's smile widened. But maybe we can work something out with you instead. Must get lonely up here. Maybe you'd prefer a man with actual prospects. One of the other men snickered. Maybe she ain't particular. Some women aren't. Abigail felt heat rise in her face, but kept her voice steady. Micah Reed owns this land. Your uncle is a thief and a liar, and everyone knows it. Now get off this property. Harold's face darkened. Big words from a loose woman. Maybe we should teach you some manners. He reached for her arm. Abigail swung the hammer without thinking, catching him hard in the shoulder. He yelped and staggered back, cursing. You'll pay for that, he snarled, holding his shoulder. Both of you. This land's ours, one way or another. And when we take it, you'll wish you'd been nicer. They mounted up and rode off, Harold still cursing and threatening. Abigail stood watching until they were out of sight, then found herself shaking. Not from fear, she'd dealt with worse in Kansas, but from anger. When Micah returned at sunset, she was scrubbing the cabin floor with unusual vigor. He paused in the doorway, taking in her tense shoulders, the way she attacked the floorboards like they'd personally offended her. What happened? She sat back on her heels. Harold Walsh came by, with 2 friends. Micah went very still. Did they touch you? Harold tried. I discouraged him with a hammer. She saw something dangerous flash in his eyes and added quickly, I'm fine. They left. What did they want? To intimidate you through me. I think, called me some names, made some threats. She resumed scrubbing. Nothing I haven't heard before. Micah hung up his coat slowly, movements careful and controlled. What kind of names? Does it matter? We both know what people think about a woman living with a man she's not married to. It matters to me. She looked up at him then. His face was carved from stone, but she'd learned to read the subtleties, the tightness around his mouth, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. He was furious. They're just words. Micah. Words have weight, especially up here, where reputation can mean the difference between neighbors helping you or letting you starve. He sat down heavily. I should have realized what people would say. You think I didn't know? Abigail abandoned her scrubbing, sitting across from him. I knew exactly what I was choosing when I stayed. My reputation was already ruined in Kansas. At least here, I'm ruining it on my own terms. You shouldn't have to. No, I shouldn't. But the world is what it is, not what it should be. She reached across the table, almost touched his hand, then pulled back. I'm not ashamed of being here. Are you ashamed of having me? No. The word came fierce and immediate. Never. Then that's all that matters. But she could see it wasn't all that mattered to him. He was quiet through supper, lost in thought. After they'd cleared the dishes, he pulled on his coat again. Where are you going? Need to check something in the stable. He was gone for an hour. When he returned, there was sawdust in his hair and a determined set to his jaw. What were you doing? Planning. He sat down at the table with a piece of paper and pencil. If Walsh is starting to move against us, we need to be ready. That means securing the property boundaries, maybe building a better fence, and... He paused, looked up at her. And making sure you're safe. I can take care of myself. I know you can. Saw the proof on Harold's shoulder. I'd bet. A small smile flickered across his face. But you shouldn't have to. This is my fight, my land. Our fight, Abigail interrupted. I live here too. Remember, I work this land, tend these animals. That makes it mine to defend as much as yours. He studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected. Abigail Ellis. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone softer, maybe more afraid. He shook his head. Should have known better. You set my leg while I was cursing blue and never flinched. Takes a special kind of strength. That. Or a special kind of stubbornness. That too. They worked on plans for the next hour, where to reinforce fences, how to secure the cabin better, what supplies they'd need from town, practical things. But Abigail noticed how often he mentioned we now. Not, I need to fix, but we should strengthen. Small words, but they meant everything. When it came time for bed, their nightly ritual felt different. Harold's ugly words hung in the air between them, reminders of how the world saw their arrangement. Micah walked to the bed, but instead of his usual single tap, he stood there looking at it. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about appearances, about reputation. Abigail's stomach clenched. Was he going to ask her to leave after all to protect her reputation, or his own? There's a preacher comes through town every few months. He continued, still not looking at her. Due again in a week or so. If you wanted, that is, if you thought... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. I'm making a mess of this. Micah Reed, she said softly. Are you proposing to me? He turned then, face reddening. Not properly. I've got nothing to offer. No sure claim to the land, no money saved. Just this cabin and trouble coming. But if it would help, if it would stop the talk. A marriage of convenience. You mean to protect my reputation? Yes, no. He looked frustrated with himself. I don't know what I mean. Abigail moved closer to him, close enough to see the sawdust still caught in his dark hair. Let me ask you something. If Harold Walsh had never come here today, if there was no talk, no threats, would you still be thinking about that preacher? He met her eyes then, and she saw the answer before he spoke it. I've been thinking about that preacher since the day you knocked on my door. Just never thought I had the right to ask. Something warm bloomed in her chest. And I've been thinking about saying yes since the first time you tapped that bed and waited. But not for convenience, not for reputation. Then for what? She reached up, brushed the sawdust from his hair. Such a simple gesture, but his eyes fluttered closed at the touch. For the same reason I came here, because you see me as I am, not as the world thinks I should be, because you give me choices instead of ultimatums. because this cabin feels more like home than any place I've ever lived. Abigail, his voice was rough. Ask me again, she said. Ask me properly this time. He took her hand, work-roughened fingers gentle around hers. I've got nothing but trouble to offer. Walsh won't stop until he gets this land or I put him in the ground. The cabin's small, the work's hard, and I'm not an easy man to live with. I already live with you. You do. A small smile. And somehow you make it look easy. So I guess what I'm asking is, would you keep living with me, permanent-like, with papers and a preacher and all? Micah Reed, are you asking me to marry you? I am. Then yes. The word hung between them for a moment, simple and perfect. Then Micah pulled her against him, holding her like she was something precious and breakable, though he knew better than anyone that she was neither. When they finally pulled apart, both a little breathless, he tapped the bed once with his hand, the same gesture, but the meaning had changed now. Not until there's a preacher involved, Abigail said firmly, but she was smiling. Fair enough. He was smiling too, broader than she'd ever seen. Though the preacher better hurry. I've been patient, but knowing you'll be my wife. He shook his head. Man's patience has limits. She laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Outside, the moon was rising over the mountains, painting the snow silver. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Walsh wouldn't give up easily, and the fight for the land would get uglier before it was done. But tonight, in their small cabin, with the fire crackling and the future suddenly bright with possibility, none of that mattered. She'd found her place, her person, her home, and no amount of ugly words or threats could take that away. The first time Abigail ventured into town after accepting Micah's proposal, she went alone. He'd protested, wanting to accompany her, but she'd insisted. I need supplies for mending, and you need to finish that fence. I'm perfectly capable of handling a few gossiping townspeople. The 5-mile ride down the mountain gave her time to steel herself. She knew what she'd face. She'd lived through it before in Kansas. But knowing didn't make it easier when she tied her mare outside Morrison's general store and walked inside to find conversations stopping mid-sentence. Mrs. Morrison, a thin woman with sharp features and sharper tongue, looked her up and down. Miss Ellis, heard you were staying up at the Reed place. That's right. Abigail moved to the fabric section, running her fingers over a bolt of blue calico. I need thread, needles, and 2 yards of this, please. 2 yards, Mrs. Morrison's eyebrows rose. Making yourself comfortable up there. Are you? Very comfortable, thank you. 2 other women shopping nearby exchanged meaningful looks. Abigail recognized one Mrs. Dalton, the banker's wife. The other was younger, probably new to town since Abigail's last visit. It must be unusual, Mrs. Dalton said carefully. Living so isolated, just you and Mr. Reed. Less isolated than you'd think, Abigail replied evenly. The mountains are full of life if you know how to look. I'm sure, Mrs. Morrison said, her tone suggesting she was sure of quite different things. Will that be all? I need flour, coffee, and salt as well. As Mrs. Morrison gathered the supplies, moving deliberately slowly, the younger woman approached. I'm Sarah Hensley, she said quietly. My husband and I just moved here from Colorado. I wondered if you might know anything about nursing. Our little boy has been poorly, and the doctor. She trailed off as Mrs. Dalton cleared her throat warningly. Abigail saw the fear in young Sarah's eyes, fear of her child's illness, but also fear of associating with a fallen woman. What are his symptoms? Abigail asked gently. Coughing, fever that comes and goes. The doctor gave us laudanum, but it only makes him sleep. Doesn't help the cough. Steam helps more than laudanum for chest complaints. Boil water with pine needles or mint if you have it. Hold him where he can breathe the vapor. Keep him upright when he sleeps. pile pillows behind him, and honey mixed with a little whiskey helps soothe the throat. Sarah's face lit with relief.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. I've been so worried.
Sarah, Mrs. Dalton interrupted. We should go. Sarah flushed, but stood her ground a moment longer. If he gets worse, would you? I'm at the Reed place. Abigail said simply. You know where to find me. After they left, Mrs. Morrison tallied the purchases with pursed lips. That'll be $3.40, cash only. Abigail knew for a fact the store extended credit to every rancher in the valley, but she pulled out her money without comment. As Mrs. Morrison made change, she leaned forward conspiratorially. You know, dear, it's not too late. You could still leave, go somewhere fresh, start over properly. A woman like you, with skills, you don't have to degrade yourself living in sin. Abigail picked up her packages. The only thing degrading about my life is having to listen to people who know nothing about it past judgment. Good day, Mrs. Morrison. She left with her head high, but her hands were trembling as she loaded her purchases. It was starting already, just as it had in Kansas. The whispers, the judgment, the careful social exile. At the blacksmith shop, she fared slightly better. Tom Harper was a practical man who cared more about payment than propriety. He had the hinges Micah had ordered ready without comment, though his apprentice stared openly until Tom cuffed him. Tell Reed I'll have those horseshoes done by next week, Tom said gruffly. And miss, you might want to avoid the saloon. Harold Walsh has been drinking and talking. Ugly talk. Thank you for the warning. She was mounting her mare when she heard her name called. Reverend Mills was crossing the street, his black coat dusty from travel, the circuit preacher she and Micah had been waiting for. Miss Ellis, he said, slightly out of breath. I heard you were in town. Might I have a word? She stayed mounted, looking down at him. If you're going to lecture me about my living situation, Reverend, you can save your breath. I've heard it all already today. Actually, he said, surprising her, I was going to ask if the rumors were true, about you and Micah Reed planning to marry. Where did you hear that? Tom Harper mentioned it. Said Reed had asked about my schedule, when I'd next be through. The Reverend studied her with kind eyes. I've known Micah since he was a boy. Good man. Carries his troubles quiet-like. I'm glad he's found someone. Abigail felt her throat tighten. Even someone like me living with him unwed? Seems to me you're trying to fix that part, Reverend Mills said mildly. I'll be here 3 more days. If you and Micah want to make things official, I'm happy to oblige. Though I should warn you, Harold Walsh is stirring up sentiment against it. Says no decent preacher should sanctify such a union. And what do you say? I say love finds its own way, and it's not for Harold Walsh or anyone else to judge. He tipped his hat. You tell Micah I'll be ready whenever you are. The ride home was a mix of relief and dread. Relief that not everyone in town condemned them. Dread at the battle ahead. The sun was setting as she crested the final ridge, painting the mountains gold and pink. Below, she could see the cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, and Micah working on the fence. He looked up as she approached, and she saw the worry leave his face. Had he been watching for her all afternoon? Any trouble? He asked, helping her down. Some Mrs. Morrison was particularly charming, but I got what we needed. She paused. And I saw Reverend Mills. And he'll marry us whenever we're ready, though Harold Walsh is trying to convince him otherwise. Micah's jaw tightened. Walsh can try all he wants. Mills is his own man. He started unpacking her purchases, then stopped. You sure about this? Abigail today was just a taste. Once we're married, it might get worse before it gets better. The talk, the judgment. She took the package from his hands, set it aside. In town today, Sarah Hensley asked me about her sick boy. She was terrified to be seen talking to me. but more terrified of losing her child. That's what I am to them, someone they need but can't acknowledge. At least here, with you, I'm just myself. You're more than that, he said quietly. Am I? You're the woman who's going to be my wife, who's already made this place a home, who faces down men like Harold Walsh with a hammer and doesn't back down. A small smile touched his lips. You're everything. Abigail, the talk doesn't change that. She leaned into him, let him hold her as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow or the next day, they'd ride down to town together. They'd stand before Reverend Mills and make promises they were already keeping. The town would gossip, Harold would make threats, and life would go on. But tonight, she was home. Not in the cabin, though she'd grown to love its simple walls. Home was this man's arms, this quiet understanding, this choice they'd made together. Day after tomorrow, Micah asked against her hair. For the wedding? Day after tomorrow, she agreed. Inside, over supper, she told him about her encounters in town, making light of the worst parts. He listened with that focused attention she'd come to treasure, missing nothing. Sarah Hensley might come up if her boy gets worse. She mentioned, I hope you don't mind. Your skills aren't meant to be hidden. He said simply, if folks need help, they'll have to swallow their pride to get it. Their choice. Later, as they prepared for bed, Abigail found herself looking at the simple gold band Micah had produced from a small wooden box. His mother's. He'd said, saved all these years. It's not much, he'd apologized. We can get something newer if you'd prefer. It's perfect, she'd told him, and meant it. Now, as he tapped the bed in their nightly ritual, she smiled. 2 more nights, she said. Then that gesture will mean something different. It already means something different, he replied, has since the day you decided to stay. She made her bed on the platform, but for the first time, she didn't mind the hard surface. In 2 days, she'd be Abigail Reed. The town could gossip all it wanted. She'd found where she belonged, and no amount of whispered judgment could take that away. The letter from the circuit judge arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a young rider who looked nervous to be so far up the mountain. Micah read it twice, his face growing grimmer with each pass, before handing it to Abigail. Court date set, he said quietly. End of the month. Judge Hammond will hear the land dispute. Abigail scanned the official language. That's only 3 weeks away. And it says here you need to provide witnesses who can testify to your father's ownership and your continued residence. That's the problem. Micah sat heavily at the table. Most folks who knew my father are gone or in Walsh's pocket. And as for witnesses to my residence, he looked at her meaningfully. Understanding dawned. They won't accept my testimony. Not as your wife. They'll say I'm biased. Or worse. His jaw tightened. Walsh has been spreading talk about us living in sin before we married, even though it's been 2 months since the wedding. He's trying to paint you as unreliable. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. 2 months of being Mrs. Reed hadn't stopped the whispers, though a few people, like Sarah Hensley, whose boy had recovered thanks to Abigail's advice, had begun to thaw toward her.
What do we do?
We fight. Micah stood, pacing the small cabin. I've got some of Pa's old papers, receipts from when he bought supplies to build this place. Maybe find someone in town with a conscience who remembers the truth. I'll help you go through everything, Abigail said, and I'll come to court with you, whether they accept my testimony or not. He stopped pacing, looked at her with something fierce and protective in his eyes. Walsh is going to make it ugly. He'll drag your name through the mud to discredit anything I say. I won't have you. You won't have me what? She stood too, facing him. Hide here while you fight alone. Let them paint whatever picture they want without showing them who I really am. She moved closer, placed a hand on his chest. I knew what I was choosing when I married you. Micah Reed. Your fights are my fights. That's what the vows meant. He covered her hand with his. You sure you want to claim me as yours in front of the whole town, knowing what they'll say? I've been claiming you as mine every day for 2 months. In the store when Mrs. Morrison asks if I'm still living in sin. At church when people move to different pews. When Harold Walsh spits at my feet as I pass. She felt him tense at that last admission. She hadn't told him about that incident. Yes, I want to claim you. Publicly. Proudly. That evening, they spread Andrew Reed's papers across the table. Land receipts, tax records, letters from neighbors long dead, piecing together a life. A legitimate claim that Herman Walsh was trying to steal. Here, Abigail said suddenly, holding up a faded document. This is signed by Judge Carter. He was before Hammond. Right affirming your father's boundary markers in a dispute with another neighbor. Carter died 3 years ago, Micah said. But his widow might still have his records. She lives in Cheyenne now, with her daughter. Can we write to her? We can try. He rubbed his face, looking older than his years. Walsh has money, influence. All I have is the truth and a wife half the town thinks is a Scarlet woman. Abigail moved behind him, rubbed his tense shoulders. You have more than that. You have Tom Harper's respect. He told me so himself. Reverend Mills married us despite the talk. Doc Morrison might be swayed. He's never liked Walsh much. You've been thinking about this. Every day since that letter came. We need allies. Micah, people who value truth over gossip. She paused, and I think I know where to start. The next day, while Micah rode to neighboring ranches seeking support, Abigail paid a visit to Sarah Hensley. The young mother welcomed her warmly, her boy playing at her feet, healthy and bright-eyed. I owe you so much, Sarah said, pouring tea. When the doctor's treatment wasn't working, I was desperate. You owe me nothing, Abigail said, but I wonder if you might help us with something. She explained about the court case, the need for character witnesses. Sarah's face grew troubled. My husband works at the bank, Mr. Dalton has dealings with Herman Walsh. If I speak against him, I'm not asking you to speak against anyone, just to tell the truth if asked, about who I am, what kind of people Micah and I are. Sarah bit her lip. Mrs. Reed, Abigail, you saved my son, but the talk in town is just talk. You know better. You've seen who we really are. Let me speak with my husband, Sarah said finally. I can't promise anything, but I'll try. Over the following days, Abigail made similar visits. Some doors stayed closed, others opened cautiously. She gathered small victories. The ranch foreman who'd bought cattle from Micah's father agreed to testify about the old boundary lines. The elderly Mrs. Patterson remembered Andrew Reed building the cabin, though her memory was foggy on dates. But for every small success, Walsh's influence showed. The general store suddenly couldn't extend credit. The blacksmith was too busy to fix their wagon wheel, even at church. Reverend Mills looked troubled as attendance dropped whenever Abigail appeared. One evening, a week before the trial, Micah found her crying quietly by the stove. He knelt beside her, gathering her in his arms. What happened? Nothing. Everything. She wiped her eyes angrily. I'm being foolish. You're never foolish. Tell me. I went to help birth the Crandall baby today. They sent for me because the labor was difficult, and Doc Morrison was drunk again. I helped deliver a healthy girl. Probably saved both their lives. Her voice broke. And then Mrs. Crandall asked me to leave by the back door so the neighbors wouldn't see. Micah's arms tightened around her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you have to bear this. I can bear it, she said. But sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a battle we can't win. Not just for the land, but for the right to live as we choose. He was quiet for a long moment, then stood, drawing her up with him. He led her to the bedroom, their bedroom now, shared these 2 months as husband and wife. From under the bed, he pulled out a leather portfolio she'd never seen. My mother wrote this, he said, handing her a letter. The week before she died. Abigail read the spidery handwriting. My dear son, I leave you little but this land and these words. The land will feed your body, but remember, we are not placed on this earth to live easy lives. We are here to stand for truth, even when the world stands against us. Your father and I faced our share of hard times, cruel words, those who said we didn't belong, but we belong to each other, and to this land, and that was enough. Be brave, my son. Choose love over fear, truth over comfort. The right path is rarely the easy one. She would have loved you, Micah said softly. Would have seen what I see. A woman brave enough to be herself in a world that demands she be less. Abigail traced the faded words. Do you think she knew how hard it would be? I think she knew it was worth it. He took her face in his hands. Are we worth it? Abigail, is this life we're building worth the fight? She thought of their mornings, coffee shared in comfortable silence, their evenings, reading by lamplight while he mended harnesses and she knitted, the way he still tapped the bed each night before climbing in beside her, a tender reminder of how far they'd come, the garden she was planning for spring, the child she suspected was already growing within her, though she hadn't told him yet. Yes, she said simply, we're worth it. The night before the trial, they barely slept. Abigail pressed close to Micah in their bed, feeling his tension, sharing it. Tomorrow they would stand before the town, their life together laid bare for judgment. Win or lose the land, they would face the consequences together. Whatever happens, Micah said into the darkness, I want you to know, these months with you have been worth everything. If I lose the land but keep you. You won't lose either, she said fiercely. I won't let them take what's ours. Not the land, not our life, not our truth. He kissed her then, with all the desperate love of a man who knew tomorrow might change everything. And she kissed him back with the fierce determination of a woman who'd already lost one life to others' expectations and refused to lose another. When dawn broke, they rose together, dressed in their best clothes, his one good suit, carefully pressed, and her blue dress made from the fabric she'd bought that first hostile trip to town. She pinned her hair up properly, added his mother's small cameo brooch at her throat. Ready? He asked. She took his arm, held her head high. Let's go show them who we really are. The wagon ride to town had never seemed longer, but Abigail didn't let go of Micah's hand once. Whatever waited in that courtroom, they would face it together. The woman who'd arrived at his cabin door months ago, broken and seeking shelter, was gone. In her place stood Abigail Reed, wife, partner, and fighter for the truth. No matter what the world thought of her, the ride down the mountain to town had never felt longer. Micah drove the wagon in silence, his jaw set with determination, while Abigail sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. The old injury in his leg was acting up again. She could tell by the way he held himself, but he'd refused her offer of liniment that morning. Pain keeps a man sharp, he'd said, and I need to be sharp today. The town appeared before them in the morning light, bustling with more activity than usual. Word of the trial had spread, and folks from neighboring valleys had come to watch the spectacle. Abigail saw curtains twitch as they passed, faces appearing and disappearing at windows. Quite the audience, she murmured. Walsh wants a show, Micah replied grimly. Means to humiliate us both before taking the land. They stopped at the boarding house where they'd reserved a room for the night, not knowing how long the proceedings would last. Mrs. Pritchard, the proprietress, took their payment with pursed lips and eyes that wouldn't meet Abigail's. Room's at the end of the hall, she said stiffly. Trial starts at 10. Best not be late. In their small room, Abigail helped Micah with his collar and straightened his tie. Her hands were steady, though her heart raced. He caught them in his, stilling her fussing. You don't have to come, he said one last time. I could face this alone. You could, she agreed. But you won't. We stand together. Remember? The courthouse was a modest wooden building that also served as the town hall. By the time they arrived, it was already packed. Abigail felt the weight of every stare as they walked down the aisle to the front benches. She heard the whispers, caught fragments. Living in sin for months. What kind of woman? Poor Reed, taken in by... She kept her chin high, her hand on Micah's arm.
Let them look. Let them whisper.
She'd faced worse and survived. Judge Hammond was a stern man with silver side whiskers and sharp eyes. He called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, and the room fell silent. Herman Walsh sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a slick man from Denver. Walsh looked prosperous and confident in his expensive suit, every inch the successful businessman. His nephew Harold sat behind him, still favoring the shoulder where Abigail had struck him with the hammer. "We're here to settle the matter of the disputed property known as Reed's Mountain," Judge Hammond announced. "Mr. Walsh claims ownership through a bill of sale from the late Andrew Reed. Micah Reed disputes this claim. Mr. Walsh, present your case." The Denver lawyer stood, smooth as oil. He presented the bill of sale, dated just 2 weeks before Andrew Reed's death. He called witnesses, townspeople who testified they'd seen Andrew Reed in town, looking troubled about money. The banker confirmed Andrew had inquired about a loan but been refused. A desperate man, the lawyer concluded, forced to sell his land to cover debts. Tragic but legal. Micah's hands clenched on his knees. Abigail covered one with her own. A silent reminder, patience.
Mr. Reed,"
the judge said. "Your response." Micah stood slowly, favoring his bad leg. He had no lawyer, just himself and the truth. "Your Honor, my father never sold that land. That paper is a forgery. My father could barely write his name, but that signature is too smooth, too practiced." "Can you prove this?" Judge Hammond asked. "I have examples of his real signature." Micah presented the documents they'd found, tax receipts, the old boundary dispute resolution. "You can see the difference, and I have witnesses who knew my father would never sell. That land was everything to him." The ranch foreman testified first, nervously but honestly, about the boundaries Andrew Reed had shown him years ago. Mrs. Patterson, helped to the stand by her grandson, spoke in a wavering voice about watching Andrew and his wife build the cabin with their own hands. "No man sells what he builds with love," she said firmly, despite her foggy memory on other details. Then it was Tom Harper's turn. The blacksmith spoke bluntly. "Andrew Reed died of blood poisoning from a cut. I saw him the day before he took sick. Man was planning for spring, talking about new fences, breeding his mare. Those aren't the plans of someone about to sell out." Walsh's lawyer tried to shake each witness, but they held firm. Then he played his card. "I'd like to call into question the character of these witnesses," he said smoothly, "particularly their relationship to Micah Reed and his companion." Abigail felt Micah tense beside her. "I object to the term companion," Micah said, standing again. "Abigail is my wife. We were married by Reverend Mills 2 months past." "After how many months of living together unwed?" the lawyer asked with a knowing smile. "Your Honor, how can we trust witnesses who support a man of such questionable moral character, a man who keeps a woman without benefit of marriage, then hastily weds her to avoid scandal?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hammond gavelled for order. "The moral character of Mr. Reed is not on trial," the judge said sternly. "Keep to the matter of the land." But the damage was done. Abigail saw it in the faces of the crowd, the way some witnesses now looked uncertain. "Your Honor," Abigail said, standing suddenly, "may I speak?" The judge looked surprised. "You are Mrs. Reed." "I am, and while my testimony about my husband may be considered biased, I can speak to what I've observed about this case." Walsh's lawyer started to object, but Judge Hammond waved him silent. "This is irregular, but I'll allow it. Briefly, Mrs. Reed." Abigail moved forward. aware of every eye upon her. She stood straight, drawing on the strength that had carried her through hostile emergency rooms and bitter rejections. Your Honor, I am indeed Micah Reed's wife. Before that, yes, I lived at his cabin. I arrived seeking shelter, and he provided it, asking nothing improper in return. Every night, he offered me his bed while he was prepared to sleep on the floor. Every day, he treated me with respect and dignity, even as this town whispered terrible things about us both. She turned to face the packed courtroom. You want to know what kind of man Micah Reed is. He's the kind who opens his door to someone in need without expectation, who works his land honestly despite having no clear title, who faces down those who would steal from him without becoming bitter or cruel. Her eyes found Harold Walsh. When your nephew came to threaten me, to call me names I won't repeat in this court, I defended myself, and when I told Micah, his first concern was not revenge but my safety. That's the man whose character you question. She looked back at the judge. I've seen the papers. I've watched my husband pore over his father's documents, searching for truth, not convenient lies. Andrew Reed's signature on that bill of sale is false. I stake my reputation on it, what's left of it. Anyway. Your reputation is exactly the problem, Walsh's lawyer said smoothly. A woman who abandons propriety, who lives with a man unwed, who practices professions unsuitable for her gender. I saved lives, Abigail interrupted. I've delivered babies, set bones, tended the sick. If that makes me unsuitable, then I'll gladly be unsuitable. But it doesn't make me a liar. Mrs. Reed, Judge Hammond said, not unkindly. Your passion is admirable, but do you have proof beyond your belief in your husband? Abigail hesitated, then remembered. Your Honor, in my work as a nurse, I learned to observe details, small things that tell larger truths. That bill of sale, may I see it? The judge nodded, and the document was handed to her. She studied it carefully, then smiled. This paper is supposedly 3 years old, she said, yet the ink is too fresh. See how dark it is? And here, she held it to the light. The watermark. Hanson's mill started using this mark only last year. I know because I helped treat Mr. Hanson's son after the mill accident, and he was proud of their new paper stamp. The courtroom fell silent. Walsh's lawyer sputtered, but the judge was already examining the paper himself, calling for the court clerk who confirmed Abigail's observation. It seems we have a problem with this document, Judge Hammond said dryly. The rest happened quickly. Walsh tried to bluster. His lawyer attempted damage control, but the forged document undermined everything. Other witnesses came forward, emboldened, people who'd stayed silent out of fear or prudence, but now spoke up about Andrew Reed's love for his land, Walsh's attempts to buy it over the years. When Judge Hammond finally ruled, his verdict was clear. The land belongs to Micah Reed, as it belonged to his father before him. The false document presented by Mr. Walsh is not only invalid, but criminal. I'm referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for investigation of fraud. The courtroom erupted. Abigail felt Micah sag beside her with relief, and she gripped his hand tightly. They'd won. Against all odds. Against all the whispers and judgment, they'd won. As they stood to leave, people pressed forward, some offering congratulations, others just wanting to stare at the woman who'd stood up to Walsh and won. Sarah Hensley caught Abigail's eye and smiled tremulously, a silent apology for her earlier hesitation. Outside, Micah pulled Abigail into the alley beside the courthouse, away from the crowd. His hands shook as he held her face. You magnificent woman, he said roughly. How did you know about the watermark? I didn't, at first, but when he kept attacking my character instead of addressing the facts, I knew something was wrong with that paper, so I looked closer. She smiled shakily. My unsuitable profession taught me to see what others miss. Thank God for unsuitable women, he said fervently, and kissed her there in the alley, not caring who might see. They spent that night in the boarding house, holding each other close in the narrow bed. Tomorrow they'd return to their mountain, to their cabin that was truly theirs now. The whispers wouldn't stop overnight. Abigail knew that. But something had shifted in that courtroom. She'd claimed her place publicly, refused to be shamed into silence.
I have something to tell you,
she said against his chest in the darkness. What's that? We should probably start thinking about adding on to the cabin. We'll need more room come autumn. She felt him go still. Then his hand splayed across her stomach in wonder. Truly, seems we'll be needing that land after all, for the next generation of Reeds. His joy was quiet but profound, expressed in the way he held her, the whispered promises against her hair. They'd fought for their land, their life, their right to be together. Now they had a future to build on the foundation of that victory. No more sleeping on the floor, he murmured. And she laughed, remembering that first night, how far they'd come. No, she agreed. No more sleeping on the floor. The courtroom was fuller than it had been the day before. Word had spread overnight about Abigail's revelation regarding the forged document, and now it seemed half the county had crowded in to witness the final day of testimony. Judge Hammond had announced he would render his complete verdict today, after hearing any remaining witnesses. Abigail sat beside Micah on the hard wooden bench, her back straight despite the exhaustion that pulled at her. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. The baby growing within her seemed to make her more sensitive to everything. The hostile stares, the whispered comments, but also Micah's steady presence beside her. The court calls Herman Walsh to answer questions regarding the fraudulent document. Judge Hammond announced. Walsh's expensive lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a look that could freeze water. Your client presented false evidence to this court. He'll answer for it. Walsh took the stand reluctantly, his prosperous confidence notably diminished. Under the judge's questioning, cracks appeared in his story. He claimed he'd bought the paper in good faith, but couldn't name who'd sold it to him. He insisted Andrew Reed had wanted to sell, but couldn't explain why none of Reed's actual friends knew about it. Mr. Walsh, Judge Hammond said sternly, I'm inclined to believe you forged this document yourself or paid someone to do it. That's a criminal matter, but first, we must settle the civil question of land ownership. Your Honor, Abigail said, standing. May I ask Mr. Walsh one question? The judge nodded, though Walsh's lawyer protested. This is irregular. So is forging documents, Judge Hammond replied dryly. Proceed, Mrs. Reed. Abigail faced Walsh directly. You said yesterday that my husband and I are people of low moral character, that our testimony can't be trusted because we lived together before marriage. Is that correct? Walsh shifted uncomfortably. It's a matter of public record. Then let me ask you this. Who would you trust more, a woman who works openly and honestly, even when society disapproves, or a man who forges documents in secret, which shows lower moral character? That's not... Which is worse? Mr. Walsh, that I loved a man before we spoke vows, or that you tried to steal his birthright with lies? Her voice rose slightly. You want to talk about character. Let's talk about character. Mrs. Reed, the judge warned, but Abigail pressed on. You sent your nephew to threaten me. You spread rumors about my past to discredit my husband. You tried to use my reputation as a weapon. But here's what you didn't understand. I'm not ashamed. Not of my work. Not of my choices. Not of standing by my husband. She turned to address the packed courtroom. Yes, I lived with Micah Reed before we married. I arrived at his door with nowhere else to go, and he took me in, every night. He offered me his bed while he prepared to sleep on the floor. Every day. He treated me with more respect than this supposedly moral town ever showed me. Sarah Hensley was watching from the back, tears on her cheeks. Tom Harper nodded approvingly. Even Mrs. Morrison looked thoughtful. You all whispered about me, Abigail continued. Called me names, suggested I was fallen, loose, worse. But when your children were sick, who did you call when Sarah's boy couldn't breathe? Who told her how to save him when Mrs. Patterson's grandson broke his arm last month? Who said it? A murmur ran through the crowd. These were truths they'd tried to ignore. I am exactly who I've always been, Abigail said firmly. A healer. A woman who refuses to shrink herself to fit your expectations. And now, a wife defending her husband's rightful inheritance against a thief and a liar. Objection, Walsh's lawyer shouted. Overruled. Judge Hammond said. He looked almost amused. Mrs. Reed, while your speech is stirring, we need facts, not philosophy. Then here's a fact, Abigail said. She pulled out a letter she'd kept hidden. This is from Mrs. James Carter, widow of the previous circuit judge. Micah wrote to her about her late husband's records. She confirms that Judge Carter upheld Andrew Reed's full ownership of the disputed land in a boundary case 5 years ago. Mr. Walsh was party to that case. He knew Andrew Reed's ownership was already legally established. The letter was passed to Judge Hammond, who read it carefully. Walsh's face had gone pale. This changes things considerably. The judge murmured, Mr. Walsh, you pursued a claim you knew was false. Walsh's lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but the game was over. The courtroom could see it, feel the shift like wind changing direction. Your Honor. Micah stood for the first time that day. My wife asked Walsh about moral character. Let me answer her question. Character isn't about following every social rule. It's about truth, about standing up for what's right even when everyone's against you. He looked at Abigail with such pride it took her breath away. My wife showed more courage in that first week at my cabin than most people show in a lifetime. She worked beside me, made a home out of nothing, faced down threats and insults. When people called her names, she kept healing their children. When they whispered about her, she kept her dignity. That's character. Pretty words, Harold Walsh called out from the gallery. But she still lived with you like a what? Micah's voice went dangerously quiet. Choose your words carefully. Harold, that's my wife you're speaking about. The woman who'll deliver your children someday. Or save your life when Doc Morrison's too drunk to ride. The woman who stood in this court and proved your uncle's a fraud. The woman who hit me with a hammer after you tried to grab her. Tom Harper called out. I heard the whole story. Self-defense, plain and simple. She had no business. That's enough. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked down. I've heard sufficient testimony. Mr. Walsh, your claim to the Reed land is rejected. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for criminal fraud charges. He turned to Micah and Abigail. Mr. and Mrs. Reed, the land is rightfully yours. All of it, and may I say, Mrs. Reed, that while your living arrangements before marriage were unconventional. Your testimony today showed remarkable courage and integrity. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others muttered darkly. Walsh and his nephew pushed through the crowd, Harold shooting venomous looks at Abigail as they passed. But she didn't care. Micah's arms were around her, lifting her off her feet in full view of everyone. We did it, he whispered against her ear. You did it. We did it, she corrected, laughing and crying at once. People pressed forward, some to congratulate, others just to stare at the woman who'd faced down Herman Walsh. Sarah Hensley pushed through the crowd, grabbing Abigail's hands. I'm so sorry, she said tearfully. I should have stood up for you sooner. You saved my boy, and I let fear keep me silent. Can you forgive me? There's nothing to forgive, Abigail said gently. We all do what we must to survive. Reverend Mills appeared, beaming. That was quite a testimony. Mrs. Reed reminded me of the biblical Deborah, a woman judge who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. Even Mrs. Morrison approached, looking uncomfortable but determined.
I may have misjudged you,
she said stiffly. Perhaps you'd consider returning to help at the clinic on a proper basis, of course, as a married woman. Abigail felt Micah's hand tighten on her waist.
Thank you,
she said carefully. But my place is at the ranch now, though I'll always help those who need it, regardless of what they think of me. They left the courthouse through a sea of faces, some friendly now, others still suspicious. It would take time for the town to fully accept them. Maybe it never would completely, but something had shifted today. Truth had won over lies, courage over conventionality. At the boarding house, collecting their things, Mrs. Pritchard actually smiled at them. "Congratulations on your victory," she said. "And Mrs. Reed, that was a brave thing you did, speaking out like that." "Brave or foolish," Abigail replied, exhausted now that the fight was over. "Sometimes they're the same thing," the older woman said knowingly. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. As they climbed the mountain trail, the cabin came into view. Their cabin, on their land, theirs by right and law now. "No regrets?" Micah asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "None," Abigail said firmly. "Though I may have made us permanent outcasts in town." "We were already outcasts. Now we're outcasts who won." He pulled her close, hand spreading over her still flat stomach where their child grew. "Besides, we won't be outcasts forever. Children have a way of changing things. Hard to shun the woman who delivered your grandchild safely." That night, as they lay in their bed, their marriage bed in their rightful home, Abigail thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the proper nurse in Kansas, constrained by others' expectations, to this woman who'd stood in a courtroom and claimed her truth without shame. "Micah," she said into the darkness. Thank you for the choice. Every night when you tapped that bed, you gave me a choice. Even today in court, you let me choose to speak, to fight. You've never tried to make me smaller." "Why would I want you smaller?" he said, genuine confusion in his voice. "I fell in love with a woman who set my broken bone while I cursed at her, who showed up at my door strong enough to start over, who swings hammers at threats and exposes frauds in court. Making you smaller would be like trying to shrink a mountain, pointless and wrong." She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ranch needed work, the baby would need preparation, the town would need time to adjust to who they really were. But tonight, they were home, on their land, in their bed, building their life together. No more sleeping on floors, no more hiding who they were. Just truth, love, and the courage to live both openly.
"I love you, Micah Reed,"
she whispered. "And I love you, Abigail Reed," he replied, unsuitable profession, unconventional past and all. She laughed softly, settling against him. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and the mountains stood eternal guard. Inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds held tight to their hard-won happiness, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Spring had come early to the mountains, melting the snow in rushing streams and coaxing wildflowers from the meadows. Abigail stood on the porch of their cabin, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching Micah work on the addition they'd started building. 6 months had passed since the trial, and life had settled into new rhythms. "You should be resting," Micah called out, pausing in his hammering. Doc Morrison said, "I'm healthy as a horse and twice as stubborn." Abigail interrupted with a smile. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you're building that room square." He climbed down from the roof frame, crossing to her with that careful gait that favored his old injury less these days. Thanks to her ministrations, his hand joined hers on her belly, feeling the movement within. "Active today," he murmured. "Like his father, can't stay still." She leaned into him, remembering another spring day, Not so long ago, when she'd stood at his door seeking shelter. Now she was home. A rider appeared on the trail below, and they both tensed from old habit. But as the figure drew closer, Abigail smiled. It's Sarah. Sarah Hensley had become a regular visitor, one of several townspeople who'd gradually warmed to them after the trial. She dismounted carefully, carrying a basket.
I brought bread and preserves, she called out. And news from town, if you want it.
They sat on the porch, sharing Sarah's fresh bread while she caught them up on town gossip. Herman Walsh had left for Denver to avoid prosecution, his nephew Harold taking over the family business with notably less swagger than before.
And Mrs. Morrison asked me to tell you, Sarah added hesitantly,
that when your time comes, she'd like to help. Says she was a midwife before she married, and, well, she says she owes you an apology. Abigail raised her eyebrows. Mrs. Morrison wants to apologize. The whole town's been different since the trial.
Sarah said, You standing up like that, telling the truth without shame?
It changed things, made people think. Some people, Micah corrected dryly. Others still cross the street when they see us coming.
Their loss, Sarah said firmly. My William says you're the bravest woman he's ever seen. Mrs. Reed.
And he's not alone in thinking it. After Sarah left, Abigail and Micah walked to the meadow where she'd planned her garden. Already, neat rows of vegetables pushed through the dark soil. She'd insisted on planting despite her condition, kneeling carefully between the rows with Micah hovering protectively nearby.
Remember the first time you offered me the bed?
She asked suddenly, bending to pull a weed.
That very first night.
How could I forget you looked ready to fight me if I insisted?
I'd had enough of men insisting on things.
She straightened, hand on her back. But you just tapped once and waited.
Such a simple thing.
But it told me everything I needed to know about you.
What did it tell you?
That you understood choice. That you wouldn't take what wasn't freely given. She smiled at him. Though I made you wait quite a while. Worth every night on that bed alone, he said, pulling her close. Though I'm glad those days are past. They were interrupted by the sound of another horse. This time, it was Tom Harper, riding hard. Micah stepped protectively in front of Abigail as the blacksmith dismounted. Easy, Reed, Tom said, hands raised. I come with good news. Just heard from the territorial capital. Walsh was arrested trying to leave Denver. They're charging him with fraud and attempted theft. He'll see prison time for sure. Abigail felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying lift from her shoulders. It's really over then. It's over, Tom confirmed. You folks can live in peace now. He cleared his throat awkwardly.
And Mrs. Reed, my wife wanted me to say, that is, when the baby comes, if you need anything.
Thank you, Tom, she said gently. Tell your wife we appreciate it. After he left, they stood together in their garden, looking out at the mountains that stood eternal guard over their home. The sun was setting, painting the peaks gold and rose.
Peaceful, Micah said. Been a long time since I felt peaceful.
Since before your father died. Since before you knocked on my door, he corrected. I had quiet then, but not peace. There's a difference. They walked back to the cabin as darkness gathered. Inside, lamplight made everything golden and warm. Abigail set about preparing supper while Micah tended the fire. Such ordinary tasks, but precious in their simplicity.
I've been thinking, she said as they ate, about what Sarah said. The town changing, maybe when the baby's older. I could help at the clinic sometimes. Not full time, but when they need me.
Your skills shouldn't be wasted, Micah agreed. Though I'll miss you when you're gone.
I'll never be gone long.
This is home. Your home. After supper, they sat by the fire as had become their habit. Abigail knitted tiny garments while Micah worked on a cradle he was carving. The silence between them was comfortable, complete.
Do you ever think about Kansas? Micah asked suddenly. Miss it? I think about the people I helped there, Abigail said slowly. The good I was able to do before they decided I was too improper to do it. But miss it, no. That life was killing me slowly, trying to force me into a shape I couldn't hold. And now I'm the shape I meant to be. She set down her knitting, moving to sit beside him, a little rounder than before. She added with a laugh, patting her belly. But mine, truly mine. Ours, he corrected, setting aside the cradle to pull her close. Everything we have is ours. The land, this life, this little one coming. As if in response, the baby kicked strongly. They both laughed. Hands joined over the movement. Strong, Micah murmured, like his mother. Or her mother, Abigail corrected. Could be a daughter who'll grow up to scandalize towns and expose frauds in court. God help us all, Micah said with mock horror. Then grew serious. Boy or girl, they'll grow up free, no one telling them who they have to be. We'll make sure of it. Yes, Abigail agreed. We will. When bedtime came, they moved to their room, larger now, with the addition nearly complete. As Abigail changed into her nightgown, she watched Micah turn down the quilts, preparing their bed with the same care he'd once shown that very first night. You don't tap anymore, she observed. Haven't for months. He looked up, understanding immediately. Don't need to. You're here. You chose to stay. No reminder needed. I like reminders sometimes, she said softly, of how far we've come. Micah smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. He walked to the bed, tapped it once with his hand, then waited, just as he had that first night when she was a desperate stranger seeking shelter. Abigail crossed to him, taking his hand. I choose this, she said. I choose you. I choose us. Every day. I choose this life we've built. And I choose you, he replied. The woman who swung a hammer at threats, who stood up in court and spoke truth, who made this cabin a home. I choose you. Abigail Reed. Today and always. They climbed into bed together, settling into each other's arms as naturally as breathing. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and the wind sang through the pines. Inside, they were warm and safe and home. Tell me again about that first night, Micah murmured against her hair. What were you thinking when you knocked on my door? I was thinking I had nothing left to lose, she said honestly, that I was at the end of everything I knew. And now I know it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She turned in his arms to face him. The beginning of everything that matters. They lay quietly for a while, listening to the night sounds, feeling the baby move between them. Then Abigail spoke again. I used to think strength meant standing alone, never needing anyone, never bending to what others expected. She traced patterns on his chest, thinking. But real strength is knowing when to stand firm and when to yield, when to fight and when to accept help. You taught me that. You taught yourself, Micah corrected. I just gave you space to figure it out. Space and choice, she agreed. The two things I needed most. And now I need different things. She smiled in the darkness. I need your hands to help me up when I can't rise easily. I need your strength when mine runs low. I need your love to remind me I'm worthy of it. You'll always have all of that, he promised. And our child will too. We'll raise them to be strong like their mother, to know their worth doesn't depend on others' opinions. To swing hammers at threats, she teased. If necessary, he agreed seriously. But mostly to stand tall, speak truth, and never sleep on floors they don't have to. They both laughed at that, remembering those early nights, the careful distance maintained, the slow building of trust that had led them here. I love you, Micah Reed, Abigail whispered. Thank you for opening that door. I love you, Abigail Reed, he replied. Thank you for knocking. Outside, the mountains stood witness to their happiness, eternal and unchanging. Inside, two people who'd found home in each other held tight to their hard-won peace, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The baby kicked again, strong and sure, a promise of the future growing between them. And in their bed, their marriage bed, fought for and won through courage and truth, neither of them slept on the floor. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying these tales of the Old West. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought of Abigail and Micah's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit the hype button to help more people discover these tales of courage, love, and frontier life. Until next time, partners.